Hi, I'm Lucy from Sew Essential and I'm here today to talk to you about toiles. So a toile is a practice run of a garment in a cheap fabric. So I'm going to talk you through when to make one, why to make one, how to make one, and then what do you do. And I've also brought in some of my toiles so I can show you some of the processes that I've been through with them, and you can get some real life examples there. So everything I talk about today is available on our lovely website, and you'll find links to everything I talk about below. And if you like what you see, please like and subscribe, because every Friday I bring you a video packed full of sewing goodness. And if you can't wait a whole week, do jump on and check out our other social media accounts as well, where I share posts daily on most of them. So first off, let's just recap what a toile is. So a toile is a mock-up garment in a cheap fabric. So it gives you the opportunity to experiment, to have a bit of trial and error, to make mistakes and to learn about the garment you're going to make before you cut into that lovely fabric. So it's useful to make one for many different circumstances. If you are just completely new to sewing and you haven't got a clue about fit yet and you want to have a little look at that and start to get some understandings. If you're new to sewing and you just want to have a go at the construction side of the garment first, or even if you're an experienced sewer but you're making something with some quite complicated techniques that you haven't tried before, you might want to do it from that point of view as well. You might want to do it if you're making a new shape for you that you haven't tried before, or a new brand of pattern, because the different pattern companies do use different basic blocks, so their patterns are graded. A size 10 in one pattern might be quite different to a size 10 in another brand of pattern. The other thing is you might be making something. I recently was making a very simple jacket, but I was going to be pattern matching the fabric. So if I wanted to pattern match the fabric, that meant that I couldn't adjust the size in the real fabric, which I do sometimes. I don't always make a toile, but if I wanted the pattern matching to be right, I needed to get the right size cut out. So I decided to make a toile for that. Another example is if you're working with a very delicate fabric like satin, for example, that's going to mark really badly if you unpick. You might want to make a mock-up garment in that instance, because you want to make your mistakes on the toile. And also if you're just making a garment for a special occasion and you want it to be, a really good fit, and you want to be confident when you come to sew the real thing, that's another good example of when to make a toile. So I think the important thing is you don't always need to make one. There are some garments that you'll look at and think, well, it's a relatively simple shift dress. I've made something like this before by that brand of pattern. There might be an issue perhaps at the side seams. I might need to let it out a little bit, or there might be some slight issues, but actually I feel confident enough I can make those in the fabric. Well, that's great, go ahead. But if you want to sort of practice and hone your skills a little bit with fitting and do a bit of experimentation and learning, then making a toile is a great way to do that. So we've talked about when and why to make a toile. Now I'm going to talk you through how to make a toile. So as I mentioned at the start of the video, you want to make it in a cheap, inexpensive fabric, but you need to be looking for something with similar properties to what you're actually going to make the garment in eventually. So for a lot of my woven projects, I do tend to make toiles in a fabric called calico, which is this cheap, inexpensive cotton fabric. It's not got much drape or movement, and it's sort of a medium weight, but it will give me usually a very good idea of how something's going to fit. And it's a light colour, which is great because I can draw all over it, I can write all over it, and that helps me to be logical and keep records as well as I go along, which is an important part of the toiling process. However, if I was going to make, I recently made a toile and I'm really gutted because actually I threw it away about 2 weeks ago. I kept this toile thinking, oh, that might come in useful for something, and then I got rid of it thinking that I didn't need it anymore. But I made a dress in silk crepe de chine for my 40th birthday last year, and I really wanted to try and get a good fit on that, so I made a toile for that. But I made it in, I had some scraps left over, or some pieces left over from previous projects. One was a polyester lining fabric which I used for the skirt of the dress, and then the other was a polyester sort of crepe fabric which I used for the bodice. And that's a great way to use up those scraps as well, you know. If you want to make something more drapey and fluid and you think, oh, calico's not really going to give me a feel for how it's going to hang and how it's going to look in the real fabric, then, you know, I keep any decent pieces of fabric, I always keep to one side, because I know eventually that will come in useful for a toile. Even if I can only make the bodice out of it, like I say, the toile I made for this dress, I had one fabric for the bodice and one for the skirt. They both had similar properties and they were both very similar to the real fabric I was going to use for the dress, and it worked really well and it helped me to get a really good fit. So that's the first thing to think about. Obviously, if you're going to make something in jersey fabric, you're going to need to make a toile in jersey as well, because jersey and stretch fabrics behave completely differently to woven fabrics, so just bear that in mind. The other thing to think about toiles as well, I remember as a beginner feeling frustrated sometimes because I just wanted to get on with the sewing. I just wanted the instructions there in front of me, my sewing machine ready to go, and I just wanted to do that lovely bit of sewing and get good at that and like learn those skills. And I didn't want to faff around making toiles and practice runs. And to be honest, that's fine in the beginning anyway. You know, if that's making you happy and you're enjoying it, then go for it, you know. I just want to say that it is worth making a toile if you get to the point where you think, I'd like to improve my fit a little bit, I'd like to learn more about how to fit garments. That's when it's really good to make a toile. And the important thing to remember is it doesn't have to take forever. So you don't have to spend hours and hours producing the whole garment perfectly. You can do that, and I'm sure the professionals will tell you that's absolutely what you should do. But in reality, a lot of us don't. A lot of us will just make the bits that we know might be an issue. So you might be making a dress where you think, I know the skirt will fit me, that won't be a problem. I never have a problem with the fit on my hips and my waist, but actually the fit around the armholes or the neckline or around my bust is always a problem, or darts are always in the wrong place, and therefore you might just make the bodice of that pattern, and that's absolutely fine. And you might choose to then alter the skirt in the fabric. Also, you don't need to make the the facings, the cuffs, the collars, those sorts of parts of a toile either. You don't need to do buttonholes and buttons or zips and fastenings if you don't want to. You can if you want to be really spot on and really understand the construction process, but actually it's not necessary. As long as you mark all of these things on the fabric, which is where it's really good to use a light coloured fabric. You can go to town with pen markings, you can mark your centre front, you can mark your bust points, you can mark where buttonholes will be. You know, you don't need to make those things. And also you can mark where your seam allowances around the neck and the armholes, so you can see if that's in the right place without having to sew them. You can just draw a dotted line on to show you where those seams are going to fall, and then you can see if they're going to be in the right place on the real garment. So you don't need to go through the whole painstaking process of creating an entire garment. The fastenings you can just pin in place instead of putting buttons and buttonholes or a zip. You can just pin it and just check that, you know, it's in the right place. You might need a little bit of help with that if it's on the back, but that's just worth considering as well. So very often it doesn't actually take very long to make a toile. Having said that, I'd also recommend as well, the temptation is there for all of us, me included, to rush a toile sometimes and speed through it, and that's fine as well. You'll find you're a lot more gung-ho because it doesn't matter if you make a mistake, which is a beautiful thing and wonderful and great for learning. But also, obviously, you do need to still try and be accurate with your seam allowances and that sort of thing. Otherwise, you're not going to get a true reflection of the fit in the real garment if you rush and you get a bit sloppy with your seam allowances or you're cutting out. It's always a good idea as well to press as you would the real garment so that you can really see how the seams are and how the fit is. It can change the fit quite dramatically, giving your seam a good press sometimes. So always bear that in mind. And it's a good idea as well to use a contrasting thread and long tacking stitches when you make a toile, because if you decide that you're not happy with how something fits or where the seam line is, you want to be able to rip those stitches out nice and easily. Like I said, you can be really gung-ho, you haven't got to worry too much like you would in your real fabric, and it just makes it easier to rip them out if they're longer and if they're in a contrasting colour thread as well. By rights, professionals would tell you make your first toile without making any adjustments, and if you are new to trying to hone your skills with fit, I would recommend that. However, for people who've been sewing for a bit longer, you might have already worked out that there's a couple of issues that you've got that you always have to do. So for me, I always have to make a high round back adjustment. There's never enough fabric across my back. So I always make that to my pattern tissue for that first toile, because I know that that is a given and it's just going to happen. So you can, you know, in those cases, you could make those first and use those on your first toile and then start making the other changes as you go along. And then one last tip as well, which is used in couture design houses. They use 1-inch seam allowances in their toiles and in their design process, and that's because you can then, you've got more to play around with. So I'll show you how I did this on a project recently later in the video, but obviously if you use a 1-inch seam allowance, you can then rip those stitches out and you've got more to work with if you need to take things out if it's too small in the beginning. So yeah, that's another little tip to use. You can use them all over the garment, or you might just want to use them in one area. I used them on the side seams of the garment I was toiling recently, but then used 5/8 seams everywhere else. So that's just another little thing and a little tip to bear in mind. So you've made your toile, now it's time to use the toile to work out what to do next. So what you need to do is try it on and assess the fit. So you want to look in a full length mirror. Ideally, if you can get a view of the back as well, sometimes get somebody else to hold a mirror up in front of you so that you can see in the back, because obviously if you're holding one arm up or two arms up to hold a mirror, to see the back reflected in a mirror behind you, that can affect how the fit, just having your arms up. So in an ideal world, if you could get someone else to hold a mirror for you, or better still, if you've got a buddy who's into sewing or somebody who, you know, has just got an idea of how clothes should fit, then you could get them to give you a hand and just point out any problem areas. But the things to look for are, firstly, I always think about what annoys you in garments that you've made previously that you don't feel fit you very well, or perhaps shop bought garments that you've got that really annoy you. Perhaps the shoulder seams always seem like they're too far in and not wide enough, or perhaps the bust darts are always in the wrong place, or it always feels tight round the hips. Look out for those problem areas. Check that the bust points that you've marked on your nice light coloured fabric are in the right place. Check that your bust darts are in the right place. Your bust point should be on the fullest part of your bust, and your bust darts should be pointing towards the bust. And if you're small busted, they should finish at about 1/2 inch away. If you've got a fuller bust, anywhere between 1 and 3 inches away. And the really important thing to remember about all of this as well is it's what your preference is. There is no rule book for these things, and if there is, quite frankly, I don't want to know about it, because I think the joy of sewing is making things you like, that you feel good in. So, you know, think about what you prefer, and think about garments that you've got that fit you really well and you really like, and think, well, why is that? What is it about that garment that I really like? You can check that the centre front is in the right place. That's often a clue for lots and lots of different things. So it might show you your centre front might be in the right place at the top of the garment, but then you might not be able to get it together at the bottom of the garment if you're making a dress or a coat, and that might tell you need to grade between sizes for a bigger size on the bottom, or vice versa. Check that your neckline is in the right place and your armholes. Look at where the seam line's going to be on those armholes and make sure that's correct, and just get an idea of where any problems might lie. Think about as well if there are any drag lines or anything's pulling. And what I would recommend then, once you've spotted any issues, is I really highly recommend this book, which is The Complete Guide to Fitting by Palmer and Pletch. It's available on our website. You can find the link below. But there's even a wrinkle dictionary in this book that shows you if you've got drag lines here, then that could mean this issue. If you've got drag lines here, then that could mean this issue. Turn to page 200 and whatever, and they'll show you how to make those adjustments, and then you can have a go at making those adjustments in your toiles. And there's also a section for each area of the body, each key area of the body in this book as well, so you can use that to get started. I think an important thing to say at this stage as well is try not to get too obsessive and you can overfit, you can become too sort of perfectionist about it, and you can almost, I've had it before where I've been paralysed because I feel like, oh, I don't know what changes to make first, and there's so many things to think about and it's never going to be right. But actually, you know, you need to be realistic about the fit of a garment as well, and not be too hard on yourself, and remember that golden rule that I said earlier, that it is about making something that you enjoy wearing, you know. And overall, if the fit's pretty good and you're happy with it, there might be a couple of little issues still, well, that's fine, you know, as long as you're happy, that's great. And then you might go on to make the same pattern again another time and, you know, work on trying to fix those issues. So don't let it paralyse you, but just use a toile as an opportunity really to just experiment, have some fun, and get an idea of overall fit and what some of the issues for your individual body might be. In terms of order of adjustments, if there are more than one adjustment you want to make, if you think there's a couple of areas I'd like to do something about, you should always make your lengthening or shortening adjustments first. And that's because obviously if you lengthen or shorten a bodice, for example, you're going to potentially move the position of the bust darts. So we always say make lengthening and shortening adjustments first, then look at your curves, and then look at the width of the garment. So just bear that in mind. For some patterns and some designs, it might be as simple as thinking, actually, I think I just need a smaller size on top and a larger size on the bottom. It might be as simple as lengthening or shortening the pattern. But for some other garments, you might think, actually, there's an armhole issue here, or the bust dart needs moving. I'm going to make some more detailed changes there. And that's when that book comes in and is really, really helpful. So what you can do is you can adjust your toile first. So if you want to lengthen the pattern, you can just slash the toile piece and add some extra fabric in to give you that extra length, for example. Or sometimes what I tend to do, if I want to take a seam in a little bit, if I think, oh, I could take a little bit off that armhole, I might stitch that in the toile fabric and then try it on again to see how it looks. And then once you've made those adjustments and changes, you can then transfer those to your pattern pieces. And I'll show you how I did that in a recent toile that I've just made. One thing I will say is it's very important not to make too many changes in one go, because if you make, say, 3 or 4 adjustments and then you're still not happy with the fit, you're not always going to be able to tell which adjustment it is that hasn't worked as you wanted it to. So if you are a beginner and you are really keen to learn, you know, you might want to make several different toiles and just do 1 or 2 adjustments at a time just to get an idea of that fit. But again, just try not to get too obsessive about it. You know, it is good just to get a general feel, make some slight improvements in certain areas, and then, you know, give yourself the time to work on learning these skills and developing and changing and learning new things. We're always learning new things in sewing. Even the most experienced sewers will tell you that they'll learn something new all the time, and that's part of the beauty of it all. And then the other tip I would give you as well is just to make sure that you're very logical when you're doing it and you're making notes. Make notes, as I said, on the garment itself. You might want to date it, you might want to put the number of the pattern that it is so you can keep it, and if you come to make it again in future, you can go back to that toile and check it still fits, or think about if there are any other adjustments you want to try this time. But it's really crucial to just keep notes and be logical so that you can then transfer those changes to your pattern pieces and then your end garment. So I'm just going to show you now some of the toiles I've made recently and how I transferred markings to pattern pieces, and what I did when I was trying them on and assessing the fit, just so you can see some real life examples. But I hope that the message that's come through all the way through the video is, you know, it's about you and what you want to achieve and making something that you enjoy and enjoy wearing. So, you know, just make it work for you. Make as many toiles or as few toiles as you like, you know, make as many adjustments or as few adjustments as you like, but, you know, just use it as an opportunity really to make mistakes and learn, and that's the beauty of this whole process. So here's the extra small toile that I made, and as I mentioned, I used a 1-inch seam allowance down the side seams because I knew although I needed a much smaller fit in the armhole area, I knew that my waist and hips probably would be too big for an extra small. I could have graded and I could have made a small or a medium on the bottom or down the side seams, but actually I just decided that if I use the 1-inch seam allowance on the extra small size and then just cut the extra small up the side seams and the armholes, that would be okay and give me enough to work with. And like I keep saying, you know, there's no sort of hard and fast rules with this. As long as you're logical and you know what you've done and you've recorded it and you know what you're working on, then it's fine. You can find your way back and you can make the relevant alterations to the pattern pieces. So you can see here I've drawn on, although the seam line originally, when I did a 1-inch seam allowance, you can see that the seam line would have been here somewhere. You can see I've had to really let that out to fit me around my waist and hips quite considerably, and I've drawn that on in that thick purple pen so you can see that. So I now knew that this fits me now. I'm happy with that fit, I'm happy with the seam line there. So then what I needed to do was take the pattern piece, and because I've got my centre front markings on the toile and I've got my bust point marked on the toile and I've got my notches, I could use that to line the pattern piece up accurately. I've turned the toile inside out as well, and then I could line my pattern piece up accurately using the centre front markings and the bust point markings, and I could see there where I wanted my seam line to be. So just making sure the centre front's lined up. So you can see I've already added the tissue on here, but you can see that that's where I wanted the seam line to be, and then I needed the pattern piece to come out 5/8 of an inch from there. If I'm going to have a 5/8 seam allowance, and that's where I want my seam line to be, where that purple line is, I've got to add on enough tissue onto the pattern piece that there's 5/8 seam, a 5/8 seam allowance there to work with. So what I did was I lined the pattern piece up like so, and I measured a 5/8 seam allowance from that line, and then I filled that with tissue, and I just worked my way up the side seam, and you can see it tapers here back to the original extra small size, because the extra small does actually fit me there under the arm, and it just tapers out down here where I've looked at where that seam line is where I want it to be, and I've added my 5/8 seam allowance on just by filling it with tissue paper. This is Burda tissue paper that I like to use. I'll pop links to it below, and sometimes I might use one of my curved rulers, so I'll put links to those below as well. If it was the other way round and you'd made a size and you wanted to take it in and your seam line was further in on the pattern piece, obviously you could just trim the excess of the pattern piece off to where you wanted that smaller size to be. And then one of the other things I wanted to show you as well was that I knew that the extra small size was going to fit me better around the armholes, but I could see if we go back to my medium that I made, I could see that the neckline was in the right place for me. So just to double check this, I marked it on in really thick black pen so I could see that it was sitting properly in the right place in the mirror. And then just out of interest, I thought, well, I'm just going to have a look at where the extra small neckline would come to. And I marked that on in black pen, and I could see that actually if I brought the neckline down to here, it was going to be far too small for me, far too low for me on the back. So when I cut the pattern pieces out, in fact, if I put that on top of the calico, it's probably easier for you to see. I kept it as a medium at the back. Just ignore this. This is one of my alterations that I have to make, the high round back alteration that I mentioned earlier. But I kept the medium neckline and I kept the medium size at the shoulders, but then I just made the extra small round the armholes and down the side seams, but used those 1-inch seam allowances on the side seams so that I could alter the fit there. And I just wanted to show you some other examples as well. So for example, you might have sewn the original armhole, which is that first dotted line that I've drawn, and then thought, actually I need to take a bit out of there and just scoop the armhole out like so. And you might have sewn that second line, this one with the longer markings, and thought, actually yes, the fit's much better now, I like that, that's where I want the seam line to be. So you would just need to take your pattern piece then, position it over the toile accurately, and then you'd be able to draw your new seam line on and measure 5/8 from there and just trim the pattern piece down accordingly. You can also slash and spread your toile, so you can see here I made this alteration straight away to the pattern piece for a high round back, which is where I slash and spread the pattern piece to create extra length in that back piece in a particular area, because I've got a bit of a rounded back at the top. But if you've never tried this alteration before and you wanted to give it a go, you could slash and spread and fill with fabric the actual toile and give that a go and see if it improved the fit for you. Equally, sometimes people on a neckline or something, for example, decide that it's a bit too full, there's a bit of gaping, so they might decide to just pin the fabric out like so. I mean, this is on an armhole I'm doing this, you might want to do it there. You might find that you've got gaping at the back armhole for different reasons, but you might want to just pin that fabric out like so and see if that works, and then you know you'll be able to see then if it does work and it looks good, you can then make that same alteration to your pattern piece and pin the tissue out. What I would say with an adjustment like that is obviously if you change the armhole, you need to change the sleeve as well. And so this is one of the adjustments in the Palmer Pletch book. I would recommend referring to that for something like that. But sometimes people just, let's just pretend this is a neckline here and it's a bit full at the front. Sometimes people just pin the tissue out like so, they'll pin the fabric first, pin the excess out in the fabric first like that, see that they get a better fit and they're happy with it, and then they might just pin the excess out in the tissue like so, but then just lay the tissue flat on the fabric with that excess pinned out, and it just tapers to nothing like so. And then they might just cut the fabric out, you know, they don't actually create a dart or anything, but they just pin some of the excess out on the tissue. But you can test all of that in your fabric first. So I hope I've encouraged you to just have a go, have a play around, be experimental, you know, a bit of trial and error, and it's a really great way to learn. So I hope you've all enjoyed that today and found it helpful. I think, you know, when I look back at my beginning of my journey in dressmaking, I wanted somebody to hand me the rule book and say, there's the magic rule book that will tell you every alteration you'll ever need to make and exactly how to make patterns fit you perfectly. And I think in reality that just doesn't exist. You know, every different pattern, every different style, every different design, what you want to achieve and how you want things to fit will change. So hopefully this video has shown you that, you know, it's about allowing yourself the opportunity to make mistakes and mess around and try different things and experiment, and learning to enjoy that as part of the sewing process. You might decide it's not for you and think, actually, no, I don't want to do that. I just want to get on and sew. That's absolutely fine. But if you are somebody who's interested in this, hopefully I've given you the confidence to have a go, but also to make mistakes and get things wrong. And I listened to a lovely podcast this week with a lady called Julia Cameron, who wrote a really famous book, The Artist's Way, 30 or 40 years ago, but she's published, I think, over 40 books. And one of her most recent ones focused on the fact that perfectionism can be a stalling mechanism that we use, and also can prevent us from trying new things. You know, and actually making mistakes and getting things wrong is all part of the process in the creative process. And she made a comment that, you know, we sometimes compare ourselves to people that seem to be doing these things brilliantly, but we forget that actually everybody started in the same place. Everybody started with zero knowledge, and it's part of the process is giving yourself the opportunity to make the mistakes, to learn, to try different things, which I think is a very exciting prospect, and I hope my enthusiasm has got that over to you today. So as I said at the start of the video, everything I talk about, the calico, the book, the rulers, the paper, everything's on our website, so do check our website out. And if you like what you see, please like and subscribe, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.